rolling hills with not a whole lot of trees but that are not cultivated until you get up in the north. When you get up in the northern section, it's you feel like you're in Alabama. It really is. So I want to start off by sharing a story with you. This gentleman is a Roman Catholic monk named Bargiel Pixner. Bargiel was German. He passed away several years ago. But the person who got me started in teaching and traveling to the Holy Land was a guy named Dr. Charles Page. Some of you have met him. He's taught at Canterbury before. But Charles was very much my mentor. Bargiel was Charles' mentor. And when Charles finished his PhD, he was eager to go see his mentor again, and he was, all excited. So he goes, and Bargiel lived nearby in a place called Tagba. We'll look at in a few minutes. But he was at the time he was at Capharnaum, which is the biblical name for Capernaum. And Charles comes up and sees him, and Bargiel has this big booming voice. "Oh, so now you are Dr. Page. Tell me, Dr. Page, look around the ruins of Capharnaum. Tell me what you see." And Charles starts describing a few things, and Bargiel's shaking his head. He says, "Oh, is that all you see here?" And Charles starts looking more detail and telling him, different little features and of the doors and the windows, and Bargiel's just shaking his head. He says, "Is that all you see here?" And Charles says, "Yes, that's all I see." And Bargiel said, "Oh, my young friend, if that is all you see here, you should have gotten your PhD in nuclear physics." This is Capharnaum. This is where Jesus lived. Here you should see Jesus. For if we do not see him, how can we know him? If we do not know him, how can we love him? And if we do not love him, how can we serve him? I think it's been 30 plus years since Charles told me that story, and it still grabs me. For those of you who will be going on the trip this fall, I hope you see Jesus. This is where you can see him. Let's look at Capernaum. Here it is from the air. Now you'll notice a green area towards the bottom with that church, white church with the red domes. That is a Greek Orthodox church. The entire area from there up to the top where to get to the parking lot, all of that was Capernaum. Half of it is owned today by the Greek Orthodox Church, which is, as you see, is green. There was some excavation in the 1980s, but they ran out of money, didn't finish. So the Greek Orthodox Church said, before anyone else excavates here, we're not going to leave it half undone. You have to post a $250,000 bond. Nobody's been able to come up with $250,000 yet to do that, so it's grown back over. The northern part, it's actually the western part, up there, is where most of the features are that we would want to see anyway, so it's where the interest lies. Here's a drawing of what Capernaum may have looked like in the first century. The houses were built of basalt stone. It's basalt rock. The Golan Heights are extinct volcanoes. There's also another extinct volcano on the other side of the lake, the Horns of Etim. So there's basalt stone everywhere. It's very plentiful, so that's what you build with. And of course, plaster to hold the stones in place. And if you've seen this picture, if I've showed you this picture before, you've heard this, but I think there's only one thing that I would quibble with about this picture, and that is you got all these drying fish down there. That cat is not going to be bothered. The cat is going to be into the fish, okay? Other than that, that's what Capernaum looked like in the first century. Here's another aerial view, and here you can see it's not long after those excavations in the 80s. You can see it's a little more open. They did uncover some things. I should have brought a laser pointer. I apologize I didn't. If you'll notice about the top right quadrant of the photo, there is an octagon right there. Those are the ruins of a Byzantine church. We'll look at that a little more closely. And that's what's sitting on top of that octagon today, the Church of St. Peter's. It is built over the traditional site of St. Peter's house. There's a tradition going back well before the Byzantine period, back to the period where Christianity was illegal. We have records of pilgrims coming to Capernaum and saying that the house of St. Peter was here. That's not proof, but that's a tradition going back an awful long way. You see it's built up. It's built up over that octagon, and you can see part of the octagon under it with other walls coming out. But this is what the house looked like in the first century. In the first century, you had houses that were built around courtyards. And you had kitchens, and you had sleeping chambers around the courtyard. The courtyard is where everything took place. That's where all family life was. Sleeping chambers were just that. That's where you slept.
Hey, Paul?
Yes.
So this looks like an enormous compound.
It is about 1,500 square feet.
And this would have been housing for a family or just for one?
An extended family. It's going to be, I said, about 1,500 square feet with an average of 100 to 120 people living there. Yeah. Privacy was not something these people got to enjoy a whole lot. Oh. Awesome. Okay. All right. Izzy, man. Amos is awesome, let me tell you. Okay. You see the courtyard's in here, and these little small rooms there are sleeping chambers. That's for the entire family, the mom, dad, and 6 to 8 surviving children. Infant mortality was terribly high, so you have about 6 to 8 that will live to, 12 or so. Once a boy gets married, he moves into another room. Sometimes you have to add on rooms. That's why this house has so many, rooms scattered about. But generally, the cycle of birth and death was such that a room would be available. Now, this room up here is of special interest because it was taken. You can see how much bigger it is than the others. It was originally 2 rooms and was joined into one. This is what the house looked like in the first century. You see the various rooms, courtyards about. These are fire pits, so cooking was probably a kitchen. And very little of this original house is left, just those walls here. I'll have to say a thought I'm going to save later. When Christianity became legal and the Byzantine Empire began, a church was built here in the 4th century. Entrance down here, and the house was added on to make a church. Later, in the 5th century, that octagon building structure was built around on top of it. Anytime the Greek Orthodox or the Byzantines built a church to commemorate a special place, an octagon was used. For example, when you go to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, which was originally a Byzantine church, normally they don't take you up into the altar area. They'll take you right down into the cave where it's believed that Jesus was born, but the altar area above it is an octagon. Now, that octagon is centered around that one room that we looked at a moment ago. You can see it, part of it through here. It's kind of dark. And the floor of the church is glass. The church that's there now is glass, so you can look down into the older structure. That room was used, in archaeology, the principle is the further down you go, the farther back in time you go. That's how you were able to date things. In the middle of the 1st century, that doesn't mean exactly AD 50, it might be AD 40 or something like that. We don't know. Somewhere in the middle of the 1st century, this room stopped being used as a residence and became a place of worship. They could tell that by etchings on the wall, what they found in the floor rubble. So the tradition, again, is this is Peter's house. And that's the room where Jesus lived when he stayed with Peter. I can't verify that, but something took place in that room. And it's so close you can't quite touch it, but you can see it real close. So going to Capernaum is an incredible experience. A couple other features about Capernaum is the synagogue. This white marble is a later addition. It's about a 4th century synagogue, but it is built on the base of an older building. And when they did some probes inside the white structure, to get a meter square area that you probed, you go down and do, it's called a probe. They found coins and pottery that was very conclusive that this was the 1st century synagogue in which Jesus taught, the one built by the centurion. It's right there. Another fascinating thing in Capernaum is they have found all kind of millstones in various stages. So it's apparent that millstones were made here in Capernaum. And it was in Capernaum when Jesus, which by the way, Capernaum is right by the lake, when Jesus said, if you lead a young person astray, it would be better for you that a millstone were tied around your neck and you're thrown into the water. Imagine the impact that would have had with the people looking at the millstones, looking at the lake, and just visualizing it. We're going to move around the lake a little bit now and go from here, from Capernaum to this little cove right here. It is called the Cove of the Parables. You see it in the landscape here, but you can even see it better from up the shore. By tradition, this is the place where Jesus taught in the boat. The crowd was so great that he had to get back in the boat. But we've had people in our institute go out in a boat, 20 yards into the water. And if you talk like this, okay, I'm going to step away from the mic, not to scare anybody. If you talk like this, you can hear it. But if you use a good projection of your voice, you can be heard all over the hillside. It's just a natural amphitheater. Tying into today's sermon, Jesus and the disciples left this place when they are going to the other side, and Bill Morgan will tell you all about that. If you weren't in New Traditions, if you're in New Traditions, you already know. But it was from here that they departed to go to the other side. Next place I want to share with you is moving around the lake from Capernaum, we've been to the cove, to Bethsaida. Bethsaida means house of the fishermen. And it is a fascinating story. This area here is on a tell, and I think Bill Morgan talked about this the first of these sessions, heard when I was listening to the recording.
Speaking of Jesus.
Wow, your timing is impeccable. That's amazing. As Bill told you a few weeks ago, a tell is an artificial structure built up by layers of occupation. And this one was called Et Tel. We just didn't know what it was. And Bargel Pixner, who we introduced you to earlier, is the one who came and said, I think this is Bethsaida. And everybody laughed at him because Bethsaida is house of the fishermen. It's got to be on the lake. And look how far the lake's over here. You've got all this land. But Bargil looked at the topography, because Galilee is rolling hills, and you have all these rolling hills around coming up to the lake, and that is about as flat as you can be. And he took soil samples from all over this flat area, and he compared them to soil samples from the mountains along the Jordan River. In 518, there was a massive earthquake. This was the big one. Israel sits on a fault line. The east side of the Jordan River is one plate. The west side is another. And they average about 100 years to have a pretty significant earthquake. And frankly, we're a little overdue.
Thank you.
Yes. But the biggest one that they have in record took place in 518, and it absolutely destroyed most of the country. Very few cities were, Capernaum was destroyed, never rebuilt. Bet Shan destroyed, not rebuilt till the 1800s. Hippos, we'll look at in a minute, completely destroyed. It was just a devastating earthquake. But what that earthquake did was pull down, knock down a lot of the soil on top of those mountains, and created this large plain. So that what was in the first century on the lake is now about almost a mile away. Now, everybody, you know, when we go to the Holy Land, we have that, I want to walk where Jesus walked. Okay, there are maybe 3 places in the entire Holy Land where you can definitively say, I walked where Jesus walked. 2 of them are questionable. 1 is certain. This is one of the maybes, and here's why it's a maybe. There's another city that has been being excavated, and some people say, well, we think this is Bethsaida, and not here. I'll show you in a minute why I still think the evidence indicates this is Bethsaida. And assuming it is, that's a Roman road from the 1st century. And I can't tell you how many times we've been there, and students have taken their shoes off and their socks off because they wanted their bare feet to touch those stones. So if you go to Bethsaida, this is probably somewhere where Jesus walked. Bethsaida has been excavated, but has not been rebuilt. A lot of places you'll go, they rebuilt the walls up to a foot or two to give you a better idea. That's not been done here. It's still pretty flat. That doesn't look much like a house, but it was, or this one. And here again. But this to me is fascinating. Bethsaida was at the scene or the site of a city in the Old Testament period, the capital of the kingdom of Geshur. You may remember that when Absalom fled Jerusalem after his revolt failed, his first attempt at revolt failed, he was sent to Geshur, to this kingdom. And you'll notice this is called a glacis, this very steep mound around the city. And the reason they did that was because the greatest army in the world was always a threat. Those were the Assyrians. And the Assyrians had a weapon that was the first millennium BC equivalent of the doomsday device. They had the battering ram. They were the only ones who had it, and they would come up and knock down the walls of your city. So what they did here was make the glacis so steep that the battering ram couldn't hit it. The prow would go up over the walls. That glacis is still there. It's crumbled down some, but that's still around the city. The glacis built, 1,500, 1,600 years ago. And when I'm teaching over there, and a student will ask an archaeological question, I say every answer to an archaeological question has a preface that we usually don't say, but we should. And that is, we do not know for certain, but based on our best understanding of the currently available information, we believe that. Okay? I'll never forget early 1990s. I was reading Biblical Archaeology Review, and they're talking about city gates and how impressive they were, and how we could talk all day about the gates, but we will not. They said there's never been a city discovered that was captured through the gates. They always came through the walls. 3 months later, they dug up this gate, Bethsaida, and guess what? That's how the Assyrians got in. But to do so, they created something, a fire that was so hot that it melted the stone. This is volcanic rock. How do you melt volcanic rock? We have no idea how they did it. No clue. I gotta tell the story. First time I excavated at Bethsaida, I got there and there was this little area where you could see somebody had tried to build something and it was sort of left, abandoned. And I asked, what's that? And people started laughing. There had been a graduate student from England who had decided he knew how the Assyrians melted that stone. Apparently, this gentleman was really arrogant and made everybody unlike him, dislike him. And his experiment failed miserably. Totally. I'm thinking of how hard you have to work on a postgraduate degree, and he's complete failure. But he was such a jerk. Everybody celebrated, and they left where he had tried his experiment as a little shrine to him. So, archaeologists are human. What can I tell you? But this gate is a fascinating. I wish we had more time to go into the details, but it is a 10th century gate. One of the story, I was digging here at that first time, the archaeologist was Rami Arav, University of Nebraska. And we get down, sometimes things can work down into the soil. I mean, far down into the soil. So I'm digging at a 10th century BC level, and I find a chewing gum wrapper. And I said, Rami, what does this mean? And without breaking stride, he said, aliens. All right, let me take you to one of my favorite places on earth. And that's coming down here south from Bethsaida to Kursi. Kursi is the site of Jesus' healing of the demoniac, the Gergesene demoniac. And you see this little area where the topographical map goes inland. It's a beautiful, beautiful Wadi Valley, the Wadi Samak. Absolutely gorgeous place. And a Byzantine monastery was built here to commemorate the healing of the demoniac. It was a large monastery. The walls, as you can see, go around a great deal. They've reconstructed the main building. And I'll be honest, the reason that this is one of my favorite places is Nancy and my sweat have watered the soil many times. We've done some great excavating here, and it's a fascinating site. In the 5th century, the land of Israel was invaded by Persian troops who came on a campaign of eradication, wipe out Christians. And this is one of the first places they got, and we found a mass grave of people who've been slaughtered by the Persians. And we found Persian scimitars, we found swords, it was an incredible experience. Now, you'd usually hear about this invasion when you go to the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, because that was the one church in the entire land that was spared. Because they came in and they looked on the walls and there were mosaics of Persian noblemen. I always said, well, we can't tear down this church. It has our noblemen on the walls. We call them the wise men. But that was the one church that was spared. But anyway, this place has a deep hold on my heart, and always will. This next one I'll show you is just south of Kursi, is this mountain right here. It's called Hippos. Should have got a good picture from the side. From the side, it actually looks like a horse's head. Hence the name Hippos. But the reason I want to show it to you is you have a city up on a hill. At night, all of the lights that are on there. This is right on the Sea of Galilee. It was somewhere close to the Sea of Galilee where Jesus taught a city built on a hill cannot be hidden. And once again, he's pointing out something that's in plain view. It was incredible. You probably won't get to go up there. Most groups don't get to go, but it's a fascinating place to explore. All right, we're going to go north now and go up to this place, Hatzor. Hatzor was a large Canaanite city, destroyed, and then later rebuilt by the Israelites under Solomon. To give you an idea, this was probably the largest city on earth prior to 2000 BC. The Canaanite city encompassed this entire area. The Israelite city was just this acropolis here. If there are Egyptian records from the period that talk about Hatzor. There are Hittite records that talk about Hatzor. It was a major, probably the largest city and major city in the world at that time. The Israelites came. Here's another gate. This one was built by Solomon. There are identical gates at Megiddo and Gezer. Kind of ground level of the gate at Hatzor. Another view, and this is the one I want you to see. The gate was built into part of a casemate wall. Casemate wall has two sides and an open space in the middle. Now, if an enemy is coming, you're going to fill that open space with earth and stone. So that now your wall's not this thick, it's this thick. Makes it stronger. But if you're not under attack, you have this open where people can live. Story of Jericho. And Rahab, the prostitute, lived in the wall. You know, when I first read it, was she a mouse or something? You know, living in the wall. No, it's oops. She lived in a room inside like this. Very common throughout the ancient world. And this is a Canaanite temple in Hatzor. It's called a high place or a bamah. And they would always have a standing stone and a terebinth tree. Man, I wish we had time to get into what they would do with places like this. It's absolutely fascinating. We've learned a lot about that religion because it's a religion that included the god Baal or Baal. And usually we read about that in the Old Testament and they're criticizing him. Well, they found in a place in Turkey, they found a document that was basically their book of Psalms for this religion, which told us how they looked at it. And push right down. Some Sunday school class, bring me in, we'll talk about it. Now I want to take you up to the very north of the country in Dan. And Dan is the headwaters of the Jordan River. That's where the name Jordan comes from. Yar. There's not a J in Hebrew, by the way. Everything that we in the Bible that says we start with J actually starts with a Y. This is the Yarden River. Yar, springing up from Dan. That's where the name comes from. It's springing up in here. See the headwaters in this area. And this is where you feel like you're in Alabama. Because this is the trail. That's actually a nature park in Israel today. Absolutely beautiful. Fun to walk through. Incredible. And also, archaeologically, unbelievably significant. Here's one of them. Do you remember when, after Solomon's death, the land of Israel is divided into two kingdoms? And the northern kingdom didn't want their people going to the temple in Jerusalem to worship, down in the southern kingdom. So they built two temples, one at Bethel and one here at Dan. And originally, these were used for the worship of Yahweh. Later, they became idols, worship for idols. And but here you can have a reconstruction of the main altar for that temple built right after Solomon's death. Wish a better picture. You go up these steps. You go to where the Holy of Holies was. They've got different courts around. It's a fascinating sight. There's also a fantastic gate system built by Ahab. Remember, Jezebel's husband. Ahab may have been a lousy guy, but he was a great builder. And as you go up the gates here, one of the fascinating features is right outside outside the gate is where the king or officials would come and hear cases for, civil cases. The gates were where civil law took place. Even in the story of, there's several instances in the Old Testament, the story of Ruth. Boaz goes to the elders in the gates to seek justice, or to work out so he can marry Ruth. The prophets over and over are criticizing, you take bribes in the gates. There's no justice in the gates. That means there's a corrupt criminal system, corrupt judicial system. I always pictured when Solomon had the two women come to him over which baby belonged to which woman. I always picture that taking place inside a palace, and it would have taken place at the gate of Jerusalem, someplace like this. Also in the gate are several little shrines like this, those standing stones. Those standing stones are significant. They're all throughout the country. And they are a place where when you come in, you would make an offering to the deity of that city. Behind you. The other fascinating archaeological thing they found at Dan is this mud brick gate that is thousands of years old. Now, there are a number of trade routes that you can use to get through the whole north to south in the Holy Land. We don't know which one Abraham took, but if he took the one most commonly used, he would have walked by this gate. It's that old. All right, jump back. We're jumping all over the place, I know. Let's go back to the Sea of Galilee. He said, there we go. And I want to show you this cove right here. Cove of the Disciples. Now, Tagba is the name of the area. I mentioned it earlier, Tagba. It's a corruption of the Greek heptabagon, which means 7 springs. And these are 7 springs where water is gushing out. The water is not potable, so what they do today is, as you drive by the Sea of Galilee, you'll see a concrete cover. It used to be an open trench, and now they've covered it in concrete. And that water is now diverted around the lake because almost all of Israel's drinking water comes from this lake. You don't want the non-potable water going in, polluting it. But one of the great things about the word in this cove up there is the water spurts out. And fishermen could lay their nets over the opening of that spring, and as the spurting water cleaned the nets for them. You remember that James and John were cleaning their nets when Jesus called them to be disciples. So by tradition, we can't prove it, we don't know, but by tradition, this little cove here is the Cove of the Disciples, where James and John, Peter and Andrew were called to follow him. Next to this cove is a little church here. This is called the Primacy of St. Peter. It is by tradition, still going to tradition here, this is the area where Jesus had his breakfast by the shore in John 21, where he's cooking breakfast and sees the disciples, and they come in and have breakfast with him. New Revised Standard Version says beach. That envisions sandy. No, it's all rocks. Sorry. Now, when I'm teaching over there, I have a scale, 1 to 10, on the authenticity of a site. A 10 is we have conclusive evidence that this biblical event took place right here. There are not many 10s. 1 is, hey, we're in Israel. This is fairly close. This is in the 7 to 8 range. Nearby, adjacent to this church, is a larger one. I love this place. It's a fascinating church. They found the ruins of a Byzantine church. And once they were through with all the archaeology, they basically rebuilt it. They rebuilt the church on the ruins and the same design and same layout as the ancient church, which is Roman Catholic today. And this church commemorates the miracle of the multiplication of loaves and fish. And you can see it's laid out just like a Byzantine church would have been. And there's still a lot of the original mosaics on the floor. It was just absolutely fascinating. But the greatest one, now if you go to Israel, they got a lot of shops. They got a lot of souvenir shops. Trust me, they got billions of shops. Every one of them will have this design on shirts and mugs and plates and you name it. Got one down in my office. This is under the altar. So here you see the loaves and fish. We have our 2 fish and our 1, 2, 3, 4 loaves. What's wrong with this picture? Supposed to be 5. Where's the 5th loaf? Some of you have heard this. Heard me say this. The 5th loaf is on the altar. It's the loaf used for Mass or communion. So Byzantines believe that this miracle never ends. That when we receive communion today, it is a continuation of the miracle of loaves and fish. Isn't that a beautiful thought? I just love that. Another quick big view coming back to our privacy church. And over here, kind of see, is a little cave. Looks like this. There's a tradition going back to almost the 1st century that when Jesus would go to a lonely place to pray, this is the cave he would go to. Lonely place in Greek is Eremos. And that mountain you just saw are the Eremos Heights. I don't know this is where Jesus went. I sure would like to think it. It is an incredible place to go and sit and think of Jesus sitting in there and being just outside where the disciples would have been. And frankly, the view from that cave is spectacular. So that's one of my other favorite places to take you. We have zoomed through the Galilee. I mean, this was even an overview. This was a whoosh. For those of you who go, although I will say this, in the Gospels, about half of the account is taken up by the events in Jerusalem, especially that last week. If you look at the chronology of Jesus' ministry, the vast majority of it took place here in the Galilee. He was a Galilean. It was his home. So, I would invite you to join us. If you didn't go to any traditions, I invite you to come join us in the sanctuary for today's service. Bill has a fabulous sermon. Since he's left, I can say that on the calming of the storm with the disciples. He brings in a lot of depth. Now, this combined class will not meet next week, but in 2 weeks, Hill will be here to talk about Nazareth. So thank you for being here. I love talking about this, even as fast as it was, but get to share some of my favorite places is a joy. Thank you. I do need to go to work, but Annie, do y'all have anything else after this, or can I close with a prayer? Or
If you have not signed in for attendance, please do so, and other than that, be blessed.
Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you for each person here. We thank you for these places that are real. They're not just places in a story. They actually exist. And that we can study, and we can visit, and we can see where your Son walked the earth. Ask you to bless each one here, Lord. Grant them a safe journey to their home.